Well, good day from CSG headquarters in Lexington, Kentucky. I'm Sean Sloan, Senior Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments, and I staff the What's Next Leveraging Innovation Subcommittee of CSG's Healthy States National Task Force. One of the policy areas the subcommittee has focused on is artificial intelligence in the healthcare sector. And one of the areas a number of states have begun to look at is whether there is a need for greater regulation and oversight of the development of AI. I'm talking today with Edmund Jackson, Chief Data Officer at HCA Healthcare, the Nashville-based for-profit operator of 185 hospitals and 119 freestanding surgery centers in the United States and the United Kingdom. HCA is also a lead private sector partner for CSG's Healthy States Task Force. Dr. Jackson, welcome. First of all, can you explain what the job of Chief Data Officer at HCA Healthcare entails?
Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation to speak. It's a tremendous honor to spend time with you guys today, so thank you. Okay, so Chief Data Officer. Ultimately, it comes down to getting the data into a fit state for analytics and for higher usage, as well as then creating tools, programs, and platforms to use that data for the improvement of clinical quality or the other objectives of the organization. So make the data fit for function, then use it.
Mm-hmm. So how extensive is the use of AI in HCA healthcare facilities, and in what kinds of applications and use cases is it being deployed now, and how do you see its use being expanded in the future?
Well, that's a very tricky question. So the first issue is what even is AI or artificial intelligence? As I've usually encountered, it's a marketing strategy masquerading as a technology. That's a little facetious. Ultimately, my opinion on AI, or definition of AI, is that it's the next impossible thing that a computer is about to do. So it's a very, very old term. It comes to us from the 60s when the first perceptron algorithms were created. And really, it's a kind of a grab-all term or a bucket term for things that are slightly beyond what normal computers are doing at any given time. So at one point that was, playing chess, and there was I remember very clearly the Gary Kasparov games with Deep Blue, and that was AI. And now such a thing exists on my phone and my watch, and is not particularly remarkable. Where AI is today, or sort of the cutting edge of what computers are about to do, is really computers that have very deep human characteristics, such as engaging in a conversation, seeing the world at the level of abstraction that a human does. So what I mean by that is a computer or a computer vision system that, instead of seeing things in terms of hue and contrast, saturation, all of those very technical terms, can see an image and segment out the objects in that image and see that's a telephone, that's a coffee cup. And that's the same level at which a human operates. So that's kind of where I define AI as. In healthcare, I don't really believe that anything going on satisfies those real terms. We have a lot of machine learning that goes on in healthcare. There's a lot of rules and clinical decision support. But in terms of computers speaking or acting or seeing at the level of a human, I don't really think it exists.
So if I were to go into an HCA facility and to see a provider, would that provider be using an electronic health record system, or as you say, a clinical decision support system, something like that relies on an algorithm or an AI function?
Well, absolutely. I mean, any provider that you see today will be using an electronic health record to, record the interaction that you have with them, as well as to provide support and, really to provide support to them. And there are a number of algorithms that run in there, from the very mundane, which identify, adverse interactions between drugs and prompt, or I should rather say provoke clinicians by pointing them out, through to more sophisticated algorithms that are trying to identify patients in need of higher levels of care, whether that is, they're susceptible to an infection, or they're showing signs of deterioration, or they're part of a very particular program. So a lot of the the places where you find algorithms today in healthcare are behind the scenes, helping and supporting and optimizing the work of clinical care. So just to be a little more direct on that, there's a lot in the press and in the literature about computers making diagnoses. We don't have that. For us as HCA Healthcare, it's a very, very clear thing. The provider makes a diagnosis. The provider is the locus of action and decision making. Computers can provide support in that, in terms of using algorithms to fuse data together to better inform, or to bring things together in a timely fashion. One of the algorithmic products that we're very proud of is an algorithm called SPOT, which is a sepsis detection algorithm. And really what it does is it's monitoring the data in the healthcare record across all 170 odd hospitals, fusing it in real time and identifying sepsis according to best practice and guidance as to what sepsis is. So in our case, SIRS plus a suspicion of infection. And what it does is it prompts the caregiver to say, hey, it appears that this patient conforms with the definition of sepsis as broadly accepted. Can you go lay eyes and hands on the patient and confirm that or deny it? So what it's doing is saying, hey, it looks like there's something going on. Please go and use your human judgment, your expertise to confirm or deny that. So that's where we find a lot of algorithmic type support of clinicians in healthcare. The other places in places like workflow to prioritize actions within the hospital or within all the various and sundry businesses that surround a hospital, so that we can best utilize our scarce resources. That was a bit of a wandering answer. I hope it got to what you were looking for.
No, that's great. So are you one of the folks who writes algorithms for AI functions? And, as we look at AI in general around the country and around the world, who are the folks that are working to create or develop new algorithms for AI?
So, yeah, that's a really good question. I used to be one of the guys who wrote algorithms, but sadly now I'm one of the guys who makes PowerPoints and sends emails. But transitively, I have a really great team that works with me and creates those algorithms. And there's something very special about HCA in that space, in that we're a provider organization. And so although my team is very deeply technical with software writers and people who run servers and networking and things like this, we're within the clinical group of HCA. And the reason for that is that's where the mission lies. And we're surrounded by clinicians of all different stripes. And they can and do guide and prioritize and direct the work that we do. And it's a really key feature in that a lot of AI or algorithms that we're seeing in the literature or in the wild are created by companies that are divorced from healthcare. They're technology companies or they're vendor companies which, although do excellent work, aren't actually in the business of providing care. And so a lot of times we find things that are like 30 degrees off the answer. It's like, this is a good attempt, but there's a real subtlety or nuance or a depth to the question that you only really know as a provider. And so that's something that we really pride ourselves on, and that we're right at the bedside. And that clinical experience directs the work that we do from an algorithmic perspective so that it's not disconnected from reality. So you find that in the provider spaces, there's a bit of that. The EMR vendors obviously have got AI people, algorithm people working. Your technology vendors, GE, Siemens, Philips, that crowd. And increasingly we're seeing what I'd consider sort of the tech titans, your consumer tech titans, your Googles, Facebooks, Amazons, getting involved in the healthcare space, kind of from an outside-in perspective or from a consumer perspective. And I really welcome it. I think they bring a depth of capability that we don't traditionally have in healthcare, and they just have a different perspective that's going to be really exciting to work with.
Mm-hmm. So as far as how the algorithms get approved, what are the organizations and agencies that are working to approve new algorithms that may be incorporated into a clinical decision support system or an electronic health record or other products? and what are those approval processes? I know that the FDA is somehow involved in that approval chain, right?
Absolutely. It's a rapidly evolving space, and necessarily so. There's an interesting question as to where is approval required, right? So what are the set of features and functionality where patients are at risk, or it is necessary that a third party is involved? So when you think of something like the FDA and its remit, it's traditionally regulating, interstate commerce in medical devices where action is taken automatically. So think of something like a pacemaker. It's behaving automatically, or a ventilator. It's performing actions on a patient, not intermediated through a human. And so that's really where we view the line, is where an algorithm or a device acts autonomously, or it disintermediates the human decision maker. Where we currently see no regulatory action, or we would argue that it's not actually necessary, is where a provider remains the agent of decision making or action. So if an algorithm, irrespective of what it's doing, is able to fuse data, explain itself, and that's really critical, explain itself to a provider and say, hey, given this data, whatever that might be, an image or clinical results or notes, and say, based on all of this, we believe that the following is an outcome, or something that you may have interest in. Here's the data, here's the reasoning, make a decision. But the critical part is the human must be making the decision. And that is sort of where the regulatory conversation is right now, is where is the line for the necessity of regulation? Is it at decision making? Is it above that, or is it below that? And it's really an active area of development right now.
Mm-hmm. So is the current system adequate as it exists, or is there a need for additional regulation or oversight or guardrails around how AI-related products come to market?
I think there is, so provided it's done in a really, really thoughtful way. This is a new space, and obviously it presents new opportunities as well as new risks. And I would be very unwelcoming of algorithms that just turn up in an EMR or just in a consumer device that are prompting a clinical action without a clinician's perspective on that. I think that's the key thing. So I get very nervous with some of the applications that I see out there in the app stores that purport to do things which haven't been through the normal best practice clinical validation, such as trials, for instance. So there's a lot of that makes me nervous. At the same time, I would also not welcome or find, it would make me uncomfortable, an extremely onerous process that anything that was algorithmic were to have to go through a full regulatory review, because it would slow down the pace of American innovation excessively. So there's definitely a line that needs to be defined pretty clearly. And to my thinking, and it's just my opinion on this, it comes down to two factors. It's what is the risk to the patient, and the second one is the locus of decision making. Does the algorithm or the AI supersede or remove agency from a clinician? If so, I think regulation is fair and appropriate. If not, I don't think it rises to the level of requiring regulation. But there's an ancillary space I'd like to talk about, which is the flowing of data. I think there's risk, obviously, in AI and how data are used, but there's also risk and opportunity in data liquidity and interoperability. I think there's no question we need to find ways for our medical data systems to integrate more cleanly and for consumers to have access to their data. I don't think anybody would be opposed to that. At the same time, there are risks that need to be really carefully considered in terms of where does that data go? How are consumers properly informed and protected through that process? Because as the data become free, they flow. And medical data, clinical data is unlike other data. And I think our experiences with technology recently indicate that we should be a little cautious as to how we, proceed in this particular domain. I'm sorry to be a little bit obtuse about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about data, backing up even from algorithms. But yeah, I remember that phrase from my long ago computer science class: garbage in, garbage out. And
right.
Even before we get to the algorithms, how critical is the quality of healthcare data to the success of artificial intelligence? And is that quality high enough? And if not, what's being done to improve it?
That is the absolutely core question. It's the center of what I'm doing at HCA Healthcare right now. Is with meaningful use, we've transitioned as an industry from paper-based care to EMR-based care, and a lot of the work has been done to ensure that the systems are transactionally sound. And so, you put data in, it goes from point A to point B and is not corrupted. So, the ones and the zeros match. Where less attention up until recently has been spent is on the semantic interoperability of that data. So if data comes from health system A's EMR into health system B's EMR, well, to what standards must be applied such that the data are interpretable? So we find it even within our single system that the EMRs in different markets may refer to things such as medications in different ways. And it's a huge internal effort to govern that data such that we can have interoperability of data just within our walls. To get deep integration beyond our walls, that's a very, very large undertaking. And we're seeing it, the promoting interoperability is being really well defined in terms of specifying FHIR standards and other standards to which data must conform in order to be considered interoperable. And I think that's a really, really important step in terms of making this real. The CCDs fly everywhere. The value of a CCD is only as valuable as your ability to interpret it. And right now they're very hard to interpret because of a lack of standards in the semantics of what's contained therein.
And I guess even beyond the interoperability issue, there may be issues as far as, if there are multiple records for the same person, that have conflicting information and everything. So one of the things we've talked about in the subcommittee is whether there needs to be sort of a unique patient identifier at some point. What do you think about that idea? Would that improve the data?
That's a loaded question. I mean, there's no question that it would improve the data. Having a unique identifier is one of the key principles of any sort of sensible data governance. Internally we have unique identifiers for physicians, the NPI number obviously, for our locations, for everything, so that we can uniquely and unambiguously identify a thing. So from a pure data perspective, yeah, having a unique patient identifier would be very, very useful. We go through a very large data mastering exercise internally to be able to disambiguate patients. And at our scale of tens of millions of patients a year, we come across every use case you can imagine, or edge case that you can imagine, of twins with the same name. And how do you disambiguate that? They live together, the same name, same address, but different people. And there's a large exercise that we go through to make sure that we track the patients unambiguously, so that we don't end up in situations where medical records get crossed or fused or split. And it takes active work, and not a small amount of it. So at a national level, to have true data interoperability, I don't know who would take on that exercise of attempting to master data absent a unique identifier. However, as you can tell from my accent, I'm British by origin, and the idea of a unique identifier for all citizens is probably not a politically tolerable thing in America. So from a data perspective, yeah, I get it. From a society perspective, I don't know if we're ready to do that. That's above my pay grade.
Right. So back to algorithms for a moment as well. One of the things that we hear a lot about these days is algorithmic bias. How does how does bias in AI happen? And, is there a way to ensure that the algorithms that drive AI don't end up baking in the biases that we have as humans? And, is it possible to help ensure that AI does not exacerbate inequities in healthcare or contribute to problems that may already exist in healthcare?
That is a tremendously good question. And honestly, it's something that keeps me up at night, because the AIs are trained, or algorithms generally are trained from the data. So they encapsulate, reflect, and hardwire history. So if a thing occurs in a certain way historically, the algorithm will capture that and ensure that it occurs again with low variation in the future. So if the historical behavior is biased, that will appear in the algorithm. And for sure, that's a real problem. The other one is it can be really insidious as to how racial or gender or other biases can actually transmit through data. I'll give you an example of one that we came across internally. We were making an algorithm for optimizing a particular workflow. And one of the variables that we used, well, obviously we explicitly do not use gender, so we sometimes use gender where it's appropriate, but we didn't use race because we were trying to avoid bias. And yet when we did a post hoc analysis, we think, this is not equitable. And what it came down to was that we had included the zip code of the person in the algorithm. And obviously that's very, very highly correlated with race. And so inadvertently, we had introduced race as a hidden variable into the algorithm. And it was only because we had pretty rigorous post hoc tests to identify bias that we were able to discover this and avoid, putting it into production. We obviously didn't. But that's broad, and it's very, very tricky, because sometimes, bias is what the algorithm is attempting to do. So what you're trying to avoid is harmful bias or harmful discrimination. But discriminating patients, and I'm very cautious to use the word because it carries such a loaded term, but what algorithms do is bias actions to some patients and away from other patients. And provided that is to the benefit of the patients, that's a good thing. If it's done on a racial or a gender or some other line that's harmful or reflects power structures in a harmful way, very, very difficult, and we can't have that. So you're finding an interesting thing where the algorithm typically can only reflect or optimize based on history. There may be bias in history. Often, biases and discrimination are hidden or occluded through variables that at first blush you might not seem to carry a discriminatory variable. And three, at their root, what algorithms are doing is differentiating and personalizing on people, which in another word is bias. So it takes a great degree of care to ensure that the outcomes that are emerging from the algorithm within the context of the system in which it's operating are to the benefit of the patients and are not harmfully biased. So there's no easy answer, I'm afraid. It's a real issue. It's a very serious issue. And what we have is explicit processes that when an algorithm is created, we compare the input population with the output population. We look at potential biases, try to identify where they are, whether they're necessary. Obviously, if you're looking at a C-section algorithm, it's going to be very strongly biased towards females, not men. That's a facetious example, but there are some very subtle ones where race or gender do in fact play a role that's beneficial. And so being very clear-eyed and very careful is necessary here. It's a sticky space, no question about it.
Yeah. We've seen a number of different organizations and companies and experts and commissions and countries even talk about sort of guidelines for the development of ethical AI or an AI code of ethics. What kinds of ethical considerations are there when we think about artificial intelligence in medicine?
Ooh, how long is this call? It's a very difficult question, because the question refracts in a number of ways. So what we do here is we go back to the founding statement of the company, which is above all else, we're committed to the care and improvement of human life. And so we literally take that lens to the algorithms that we create. And we say, does this improve our ability to care for and improve human life? And in a healthcare organization, it's obviously the patients who come first. In addition, we have to consider our colleagues with whom we work. What is the impact of this algorithm or this AI on them? And is that improving life? So there's a double-edged thing here where what I want to talk about, let's talk about an algorithm that we created for sepsis detection. We looked at it in a couple of ways. Firstly, what it does is it very rapidly identifies patients with sepsis and coordinates care for them. And that's obviously good for the patient. So we saw that in the outcomes. But it's also important to think about, how does this affect the caregivers? Are we barraging them with 1,000 blinking lights and dinging bells? Well, that's not helpful. So we were very cautious in the way that we designed the workflow around it, that it was helpful and reduced the burden on the care providers, such that, what it did was say, okay, what's the minimum intervention necessary, and what's the minimum distance in terms of workflow from where you are today to effective use of this algorithm, so that it was improving their lives rather than detracting from it. So those are the two major pieces: are what's the effect on the patient, what's the effect on the caregiver, and then writ large, what's the effect on society of these things. So you can't be too thoughtful.
Mm-hmm. At our most recent subcommittee meeting, one of our members asked about a couple of interesting scenarios. One is, will we get to a point where there are so many algorithms and AI tools available that if you go to one healthcare provider and they have one type of EHR or clinical decision support tool or system integration software, and I go to a different provider who has different AI systems in their practice, will we get two different standards of care? Then the flip side of that is, what if there's only a handful of algorithms that all give providers essentially the same guidance, and it turns out in the future that guidance is faulty? For example, if there had been an algorithm 10 years ago that was basically advising providers to overprescribe opioids, might we have had an even worse crisis on our hands today? Or, the same could be said of overprescribing antibiotics or anything else, I guess. But, how is AI likely to impact utilization trends and standards of care, equity and disparities issues?
Deep question again. The answer is yes. I think that we will see a growing number of AIs out there, and it will affect the care experience that you experience in any particular venue. And I mean, the truth of the matter is that that's already the case, depending on the physicians and the nurses and the other caregivers in any given care setting. So, if you have the superstar doctor in a particular hospital, your care experience will be different there today as elsewhere. I mean, and we know and accept that as a society already today. AI will, not fracture, what's the word I'm looking for? AI will play in a similar pattern in that algorithms will be baked into products. So it may be that I'm not going to use real vendor names, but vendor X's ventilator is better than vendor Y's, and that's just going to be the case because it has a better AI algorithm, and that will become known. Or hospital system A is more able to deal with infections because it has an AI, and hospital system B doesn't. So yes, there will be differences there. I'm strongly committed to leveling those things out. The guidance from my boss, Dr. Perlin, is that if an algorithm that we develop is of broad benefit to mankind, then we should make it available to them, and that's what we're doing. If an algorithm is more operational or financial, well, then we're going to run our business more effectively and view that as a competitive advantage. But where it comes to care for patients, that's not a competitive advantage. That's just, basic humanitarian concern for one another. And so that will become available. But that's just from our side. I don't know what the position of other companies will be. We're seeing More broadly in the AI space, initiatives such as the Open AI Institute, which is funded by Sam Altman and Elon Musk, and their concern is the same as the question you've just raised, which is most of the really high-end AI development is occurring within private organizations at the cutting edge of technology, your Googles, Amazons, Facebooks, Apples. And they were concerned that this would become a capability available only to those organizations, which have very, very harmful effects. And I agree with them. So they founded the Open AI Institute. And what it does is it keeps track with the developments of cutting edge AI and makes them available as in sort of an open source type of model. And I think in healthcare, we're going to have to adopt a similar type of approach so that what is of benefit to mankind generally is made available, so that we don't have extreme disparities as a result of AI, because there's no question that that's a foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm. The context of all this, a number of states have started to look broadly at artificial intelligence writ large from a variety of different perspectives. And we know there are a lot of different applications for AI across a number of different fields and everything. Do you see a role for state governments in helping to shape the development of AI in medicine in particular?
I do. I think, one of the real beauties of America is the federal system and the state system where, we can get so much innovation and thinking done and experimentation even by having all the states do things according to their own local characteristics. And I think that's one of the tremendous strengths of America. And I don't think that's any different here. I would encourage the states to really think about how to promote openness in this space. So that to me, again, maybe my own perspective. The tension here is if something is overregulated, it's going to slow down. And there's no question that AI can be a massively beneficial capability in the healthcare space. It could also pose extreme risks if misapplied. And so I think the tension is what's the right level of regulation. And I would propose that the way forwards on all of this is to promote interoperability and promote openness of these types of capabilities so that what's going on is occurring in the open, it's in a shared fashion, and it's to the benefit of the population generally.
Great. Well, finally, the name of our subcommittee is Leveraging Innovation. So we're interested not just in how things like AI are being deployed and regulated in healthcare, but also how they can be leveraged to reduce costs, improve access, improve quality, produce better health outcomes, all of those metrics that those in healthcare and policymakers alike want to move the needle on. Right. So my last question to you is, how do you see the promise of AI to do all of that? And is there anything that you haven't mentioned today that may be needed policy-wise to help us be able to leverage the full capabilities of AI?
That's a really great question. To my mind, there's no question that AI is going to be a game changer in healthcare, as it is everywhere else. I personally think that the difference is not going to be where people currently seem to be expected, which is in the sort of the diagnostic space. I think physicians are incredibly good at diagnosis, and the people get by and large, get the right diagnosis. Where we have opportunities in terms of efficiencies and cost reduction and time in the healthcare system reduction for the patients is on the rest of it. It's administrative, it's operational, it's all of the business and the apparatus of healthcare. My experience is that healthcare really is lagging behind many other industries in terms of technology adoption. And so at this point, a lot of AI is just not possible in healthcare in the same way as it is in other industries, because we haven't digitized to the same degree that other industries have. If you look at something like a supply chain industry or the retail industry, they're very, very highly digitized. Every element of their business exists in databases with real-time connectivity and really strong governance. And so the data representation of reality is strong, and hence the AIs are very powerful and useful. In healthcare, we're earlier in that journey, and that's not because we're laggards or slack. It's because the complexity of healthcare is enormous. And so creating a high-fidelity digital representation of healthcare is extremely tough. And the industry is very, very fragmented as well. And so we need help and time to advance to a more digital reality before AI becomes, before the promise of AI is fully realized, would be sort of my first overall statement. And the second one is, again, it's less about the fancy diagnostics and more about using AI to reduce friction in the healthcare system, in terms of automation, in terms of administrative lightening. I think that's where the real first benefits of AI will be felt.
Well, Dr. Jackson, I want to thank you for joining us today and providing your great knowledge and perspective, which will definitely help us inform our work, the work of our subcommittee and task force. Thanks also to you and your colleagues at HCA Healthcare for being such a great lead partner in our work. I'm Sean Sloan at CSG headquarters in Lexington. Thanks for listening.